The conversation about COVID-19 has changed over the last couple of weeks. That conversation has primarily been focused on how many people are being hospitalized, how many ventilators do we have, and whether or not we have PPE.
But there's a whole suite of other questions that has been percolating among emergency medicine doctors and critical care doctors on whether this vital sign we've been relying on for decades is sort of lying to us. It's very humbling, in the 21st century with all the scientific advances we've made, and we just don't really know the answer. We're all puzzling through it together. One of the biggest questions that we're all debating is which patients need to be put on a ventilator. A couple weeks ago, our threshold for putting a patient on a ventilator was lower than it is now because of what we've started to learn about the disease.
The vital signs that we take are temperature, heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate, and oxygen saturation. And for the mild COVID patient, the person coming in with some shortness of breath, some cough, maybe some fever for the last couple of days, the first thing we tend to see is a drop in the oxygen saturation, which is a measurement of how much oxygen is being carried by the blood, essentially. And for someone who's normal and healthy and doesn't smoke, that should be pretty close to 100%. And in someone with mild COVID, we might see it somewhere around 90 to 95%, potentially even lower than that, depending on how severe it is. Now, for somebody with a more severe COVID case, you're going to see an increased respiratory rate, as well as a really markedly low oxygen saturation.
This is one of the biggest mysteries with this disease. When someone has an O2 sat in the 70s, you expect them to look bad.
The term that we usually use is air hungry. They're sort of gasping for air when a patient has a low oxygen saturation.
People are coming in with these low oxygen saturations, which would correlate with how much oxygen they're getting to their vital organs. And they actually look pretty okay. And we don't really know why. And there's not really another disease process that seems to do this. This was a picture posted on Twitter by another emergency medicine physician. And it's this picture of a patient on her belly with the monitor overhead showing this shockingly low O2 saturation level, an oxygen saturation that would terrify you. So you'd worried that, their heart was going to stop in the imminent future. And she's on her belly just clicking away on her phone.
I had a patient who had an oxygen saturation in the high 70s, low 80s, talking on his cell phone. And we try to minimize the time we go into patients' rooms. So I looked at him from outside the room and gave him a thumbs up to make sure he was okay. And he gave me a thumbs up back. And a month ago, that was a patient that we'd be prepping to intubate potentially because everybody was so nervous about him. And now we're giving him a thumbs up through a door. We all recognize that intubation comes with a lot of risks. The longer that you are living on a ventilator, your body can get weaker and it's harder to come off of that ventilator and breathe on your own again. So it's a really big decision to decide whether or not that's the move that you make.
When you're on a ventilator, you're generally sedated. Sometimes in order to allow the vent to breathe for you appropriately, you might even have to be paralyzed for a period of time, being stuck in a bed for days and days. You'll lose muscle mass and get weaker.
I think there's also a real human loss of going on a ventilator as well. There's a large proportion of people that would be put on ventilators for COVID that will not survive and live the rest of their days essentially on a ventilator. And that comes with a really, really huge cost to loved ones and family who can no longer communicate with that person. So when I'm intubating a patient, I'm very cognizant of the fact that I might be sort of sealing that moment between when a patient can communicate with their family members and when they can't anymore.
I think we've started to be a little more permissive with how low we allow people to hang out on low oxygen because based on the theory, if they're looking good, if they're talking, the worry is that at a certain point you could do more harm than good by intervening too heavily. one thing that we are really struggling with is how to balance fighting the viral infection with potentially fighting what seems to be an immune over-response in certain patients. If you've heard the term cytokine storm, that's what that's referring to, is the immune system goes into overdrive and begins causing more problems than sometimes the virus itself. If you give medications to tamp down that reaction, you run the risk of leaving the body exposed either to that ongoing viral infection or to an infection that might come after, some sort of bacterial superinfection, and that in an already kind of weakened state can overwhelm the body. I've heard a lot of different proposed cutoffs or lab values where you might start steroids or you might start an immune modulator, but we don't really have an answer. We don't have any clinical trial data on this. We're playing it by ear a little bit.
The question of who to give anticoagulation to is an evolving question. We don't know is the brief answer. When we get blood work on a patient who has COVID, a lot of the tests that seem to be elevated are proteins that are involved in the clotting process. When those are extremely elevated, we have to assume that there's something kind of going haywire with the clotting process itself.
Should patients be anticoagulated? Because it seems there's strong predisposition in this disease to develop clots, and that can damage a lot of vital organs. And we just don't really know the answer.
Many times, even before the COVID era started, we would have to give medications or do fairly risky or invasive procedures based on our best educated guess at what might be happening and sort of weighing risks versus benefits. So in that respect, not much has changed in terms of the way we think about this disease. The really big change has been the volume and the frequency at which we are making those decisions based on our best educated guesses.
I'm not sure there's been a time where there's been uncertainty about a disease with this sort of incidence and prevalence. Maybe since the beginnings of the HIV and AIDS epidemic.
It's tough to see patients alone in the emergency department. I think that's one of the hardest parts. I've really focused in my career on when I'm seeing a patient dying or likely to die, to really make that moment as good, and I know that's a strange word to use, but as good as possible for the patient and their loved ones. And that's not something I feel like I have the same power to do anymore. So that's been emotionally challenging for me personally.
I fully understand the reasons from an infection control perspective, but it takes a real human toll, and it hurts to have those conversations. I feel terrible every time I do it.